Welcome to CGTN at the table again. Today we are reviewing some of the most important highlights of this year's two sessions happening right here at the very heart of Beijing. And we are live streaming our broadcast on Facebook, Twitter, Weibo, YouTube, and CGTN app. Today we have two very interesting colleagues of mine joining us, Sean Callebs coming all the way from CGTN America, from DC, right? And Jane Kiyo coming all the way from Africa, from Nairobi, CGTN Africa. Welcome both.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to be here.
So today we will talk a little bit about one of the most important highlights of this year's political event, which is the election of the new leaders, because the two sessions happen every year, but not every year we elect a new leader here in China. President Xi has been re-elected as for his second term of the president here in China. And I think if we talk about who this person is and what shaped President Xi as he is today, definitely we need to look back to what happened in his past, right? And I heard that Sean has visited his second, what he calls the second hometown of President Xi, right?
Exactly. We're down in rural Shanxi province. It's not a long plane ride from Beijing, but it's a world different once you get down there. We were in Liangjiahe, which is a very small community, but President Xi went back there as a teenager. He was in his early teens when he was basically forced to go there.
What happened to him?
It was part of the Cultural Revolution. He was sent down, and he had to do 7 years of hard labor, work in the fields. It was a very brutal lifestyle, very difficult. The people who went through it, we were able to talk to some down there, but it really shaped President Xi, who he is today, and guided his leadership abilities. You can really see how he has this touch with the common man in China because of what he went through, and also this tremendous passion he has for lifting China out of poverty.
I think this is really interesting because not every president, not every world leaders today are actually experiencing something like this. Most presidents in the United States would, graduate from Harvard and then becoming a congressman or someone on top in the big corporations, and then they ran for the White House.
Yeah, without question. If you think about what happened back then, it was the very late 60s. President Xi's father was imprisoned. He was sent down, and he lived in a cave. And unless you have seen this, actually been down there, it's very difficult to explain. But there's wonderfully ruggedly beautiful mountains down in that area, and people would carve these caves out of the very soft dirt and then reinforce them. When President Xi first went down there, he lived with 5 other people in one cave for 2 years. Then he moved to another cave, and finally he spent his last 2 years in a cave by himself. By then he was 22, and he had won over the people in that area, and there were quite a few down there at the time. He had become the party secretary of the village at a very young age, and he showed the leadership abilities that he carried on. He was able to help construct a dam down there. He developed the first pit to bring methane out for the people down in that area, and he was able to. A lot of folks had to walk to get the goods that they needed to subsist on in town. Well, he was able to bring a large section of those in to Liangjiahe, and it was basically like a little store, so people didn't have to make that long walk, so it was a lot easier. But he had a very brutal lifestyle. He had to get up and work the fields every day, but the one thing people talk about, he was always using his mind. They said he was a very thoughtful person. He wouldn't speak without thinking first, and he was constantly reading. That's the one thing we heard. And not just the books that you would expect, the teachings of Mao, communism, socialism, things like that, but he was also able to read Hemingway, Old Man and the Sea, and he's talked openly about reading Shakespeare while he was on the hills tending goats. And unless you see those hills, how difficult it was, they did some terracing where they flattened out certain areas of the mountain because they had to use every square inch to provide food for all the people down there. Remember, it was a tough time.
So has that region changed much compared to what happened when Xi was there?
It's changed a lot, simply because of who lived there. It's now a tourist area. And in the summer, when the weather is good, we're told 2,500 to 3,000 people a day come down there. They want to see where the president lived. They want to talk to the people. And there are some down there who were down there then. One lady we met was a delight, Liu Jin Liang. I think I'm getting her name right. But she was 19 when then President Xi was down there. And she talked about her wedding night. There's a fable in China that people prank wedding couples on there. And she said that Jinping pranked her all night. And I thought to myself, I've never heard anybody refer to the president by his first name. So it was really interesting to hear that. And she still lives in a cave down there.
Oh.
And you may know the very well-known story about when President Xi went back to the area. She presented him with a pair of shoes that she had, and she just wanted to give President Xi the shoes. Instead, he said, no, I must pay for them. But poverty is still a big problem down there. They're trying to alleviate it. Only 400 people live in the village now, far fewer than back in the 60s, 70s. And chiefly because the area, there's not enough economic activity to sustain it. There's a lot of farming, orchards, the wonderful apples that come from that region, and there's a lot of tree farming because they're planting trees on those hillsides trying to reduce erosion, even though it's an arid climate and there's not a lot of rain.
So
but they're
that's an interesting part, because if you talk about that, poverty alleviation has been one of the most impressive goals that President Xi has promised to Chinese people, that eradicating poverty by the year 2020. But when he first took office 5 years ago as the Chinese president, there were still like 100 million people living in poverty. Over the 5 years, they cut it by 70 million. Now there are still 30 million. But it seems that it's not just 70% of the job done, because the last 30 million people are the last mile, cutting of poverty, and they are actually living in extreme poverty, where some of them are handicapped, losing the ability to work, and it's difficult for them to make money. And also people who are, living in remote mountainous areas in China. So they are actually the most challenging part.
Very much so. And I think that the one thing we did hear from the people down, not just in that village, but in the broader area of Shanxi, is the devotion that President Xi has. And while there is government funding, China is spending billions trying to alleviate this problem. It's a huge problem, even though President Xi in the past several years has reduced the poverty rate from about 10% to 3 to 4%. In a nation of 1.4 billion, there are still a lot of people living in abject poverty. And
so I think that might probably be a place where President Xi's inspiration of poverty alleviation has come from in his presidency.
Without question. And that's one thing we heard over and over again. If you, there's a lot of pictures of him on the walls in the caves, and he's a very thin, good-looking man, but I mean very thin, because there just wasn't a lot to eat. In the various rooms, there were the old clay pots with lids on them, and inside millet, just a grain. There was no wheat, basically, so they had to eat what they could, and they had very rudimentary tools lying around, like Stone Age, like a stone wheel on a stone ground where they would grind, push to grind the grain. So I mean, it was very, very difficult lifestyle. And one thing that we also heard, one time he said, "I just wish people could have meat, not every day, but just every now and then have meat." They just didn't have that luxury. So it really touched him, and that set a fire clearly in him, and helped him become the leader that he is today, and move on from there and go on to some very different provinces and do very well.
Yeah, let's make a wild jump from his teenagehood to the time that he was in his 60s, because over the past 5 years he was already in his 60s, and the president from that poor area was actually the same president who has led China to build at least 2 aircraft carriers now, and also has made China the world's second largest economy by alleviating poverty at such a large scale, and building all the skyscrapers in cities like Beijing and Shanghai. I think Jane was quite impressed by something like this in China, right?
I was, by many things. And just hearing Sean speak about his background, it clearly shows why he is the way he is right now. And also speaking to the NPC deputies yesterday, just in reaction to the re-election and the election of the new leadership, it's the one thing that constantly came up. And they were telling us, you know what, we need this continuity because it has given us confidence because of what it has done over the last 5 years. And that is not escaping the minds of everybody, at least the NPC deputies and even the Chinese people, because there's been a lot of development over the last 5 years. I don't think in China's history it's ever been where it is right now, even globally. Wherever you go, you can tell China is rising and rising in terms of even its global influence. And so one of the things that the deputies were also telling us yesterday is that they believe in this leadership. They also, in fact, one of them told us, we know the road ahead is difficult because the times are also changing, the country is evolving. We are also moving to provide standards and high quality we are raising our standards. It's not just about the figures, it's not about the 2 digits, it's also about the quality of what it is we're delivering to the people.
When some Western media is covering how these deputies are responding to the re-election of President Xi as the top leadership, they would say that these people are just showing their loyalty to the president, but actually they would imply that these people are faking their support to President Xi. But from your perspective, what do you think is that?
Well, I would beg to differ, having been a first-timer at the 2 sessions and just being able to also tour China in covering different stories. I'm able to see firsthand what exactly is going on in this country. And you're actually blown away when you think about 1.4 billion people, like you say, and you go to the train stations, you go to the airport, and everything is working. And you can see this...
Very fluidly, too.
You know,
Yeah.
that is shocking.
Yeah,
and you kind of think, you know, like where I come from, probably in African countries or any other country, there are 2-3 million people or 30 million people, and there are sometimes constant breakdown of services. But then you come here and you find, my goodness, systems are working. And I think for me, what has blown me away in terms of the whole process, it's not just that it's well structured and well organized, also the amount of discipline in terms of when I look at the work reports that are given, this is like a report card.
Yes, yes.
You know, this is where we are vis-a-vis what we promised. Where are we losing? You know, there are people who are also gauging themselves, which is what is lacking in most other countries. That, you know what, we make promises, we're here to keep them, and we intend to deliver the best of services to our people.
There are 2 things that stand out for me from my time down in the village as well. One, his reading, you got the sense that's what gave President Xi freedom. You know, when he was very limited on where he could go and what he could do. And I think we're seeing maybe some of that in the way he looks at the whole globalization, the Belt and Road, connecting all these various countries, working with the
Asia,
continent of
Africa,
Africa,
yeah.
Eurasia. And then secondly, the quality of education is also improving. And I think that you can't lift people out of poverty simply by dumping money on them. And that's what we heard from the people down in Liangjiahe. Liangjiahe.
Yeah.
Sorry. And
It's about helping them to do their jobs, right?
You can't just give them money. They want their own self-reliance. They want to find a way to do that. And there was a primary
give
school.
them a fish or feed them for a day, but teach them to fish or feed
Teach
them for a
them how to
lifetime.
fish, exactly, yeah.
There was a primary school that in 2016 had 21 or 23 students, and now more than 90. And these students are often what they refer to as left behind. Their parents are going elsewhere to work because there's not a lot of income there. So 60 of the students live at the primary school, taken care of by the teachers. They're provided 3 hot meals a day. They're also given clothes. A lot of that comes from the government budget, but there's also a lot of philanthropical help. A state-run tobacco company is donating paper and pens and things to write on. There are also books. And you see these kids, and you see their faces, and you see how eager, and I would give anything to have that kind of enthusiasm, that kind of energy. And you see them run around, and you just get the sense, certainly the hope, that their life is going to be easier than their parents.
And it's
But if it-
interesting
yeah.
that you mentioned education. I think 2 days ago, when the Education Ministry was given its work report or
Yes.
its press conference,
yeah.
you've got to understand also the amount of money that is being put into reforming the education sector. Just because the country is also moving very fast-paced, and they accept that, you know what, we need to change with the times. And I think what I learned when I was doing research, because for my stories, is that this is one of the countries where teaching is still a very highly ranked profession, and teachers are highly ranked, and the government is spending a lot of time, a lot of money in training them because they are valuing they are trying to reform the education sector. They believe that is core in the development agenda. So I think the education factor also plays a big role.
Yeah, so it seems that many things happened in the past 5 years under President Xi's leadership, but some of them actually were unimaginable just 5 years ago, before President Xi took office. For example, the day after President Xi took office, he said, "I'm fighting corruption, and I'm going to arrest those politicians who are corrupt." People would think, at that time, corruption is a rampant problem here in China. People would think, what are we going to do? Are we going to arrest them all, something like that? But it really happened. Over 1 million officials in China have been punished for either violating party rules or disciplines or the laws here in China.
It's a big number.
It's a big number, and over 100 of them are above the ministerial and provincial levels.
And I think it's about to get worse, or it's about to get serious with the new anti-corruption agency. It
Yes.
simply shows the seriousness of the administration in trying to root out this vice.
Yeah,
Just
we'll talk more in detail about that. But also there are many other things that President Xi promised, like poverty alleviation, that is going to make the number from 100 million to 0 in just 10 years, which is in 8 years actually, which was also unimaginable. And also things like upgrading China's economy, making China one of the most important innovation hubs across the world, is also something that was unimaginable. Now we have Alibaba, we have Tencent, we're having WeChat going all across. I think you guys are also using the app, right?
Oh yeah,
think so.
The kid I use WeChat. I'm a king at it now.
I keep saying this is one big laboratory.
Yeah.
Something is always cooking.
But it still
terms
is
of
two
technology.
worlds, though. And that's the thing. They have to find a way to bridge that because they have, Shanghai and Shenzhen and Beijing and all this wonderful, high tech, and then you go into these other areas, and it's like, wow, it's.
Tell us.
It's-
I mean,
it's
I want to
eye-opening.
experience that. As a journalist, I think you got the best story. Getting to have
I have
that
had
view.
an amazing month. I mean, I've got to do stuff in a month.
What is it like?
Well, we also went to the Northeast,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
an area, and just to tell people about that, in 1959, they discovered a massive oil reserve in Daqing, and that really helped China to a huge degree. It provided their own source of oil, not just for its economy and its people, but also a source of pride. And now that oil is running out. I mean, they've been going into it for now half a century or more. And so they're trying to find ways to breathe new life into that area. So they have a new major luxury car manufacturer that's set up there, and it's provided jobs for 2,800 people, and they want it to be the new hub for automobiles. So it's, we got to go to the Northeast, we got to go to Shanxi area, and then, we were also just northwest of Beijing, where the big hub for the Winter Olympics were going to be coming, and that's changing, the new high-speed rail that's carving through. I mean, China is a country that's on the move right now, and seeing it
Yes.
firsthand is just amazing.
Tell us more details. I think we were actually on the Fuxing bullet train. Actually, the name of the train was named after one of President Xi's most important political slogans, which is the seeking China's national rejuvenation. So Fuxing actually means rejuvenation. So the train is actually the so-called rejuvenation train, and now it's the world's fastest. Right.
Train, and that was quite an experience. First of all, that I've never been inside a high-speed rail train. So it provided a very good experience for me, especially knowing it's also the world's fastest train. And then just being able to travel, I think, 1,400 kilometers in just 4 hours. And in Nairobi, we've got the SGR, that is Nairobi to Mombasa is about 480 kilometers, and we're using the same 4 hours. So it was a world of a difference.
Yeah.
But I think those are just some of the achievements that people would point out over the last 5 years. Talk about military reforms. Just like here, you remember the president lodged this big military shakeup in terms of modernizing it, bringing in sophisticated equipment, trying to reduce the number of troops in the army. And then we talk about even the reforms, the opening up of the world. I think President Xi has been the main driver of the country's foreign policy. Never before have we seen the country, leap so, can we say?
So
We say leap what?
Yeah, leap forward. And to me, it's fascinating because when China embraces something, they go all in. Because for the Winter Olympics, China's not a nation known for everybody enjoying skiing. Well, President Xi is challenging 300 million people to get more active in winter sports. And when we went out to Zhangjiakou, which was more than a 3-hour drive, but once that bullet train goes in, it's be 50 minutes from
Wow.
Beijing. And there are farmers who have learned to ski over the past 10 to 15 years, and they are teaching small children how to ski.
Amazing.
So when the visitors come, they're going to be greeted by these wonderful smiling children saying, welcome, welcome, we want to show you around, this is our beautiful country. So it's to me, it's fascinating how just the whole country is moving in a very positive fashion.
This is fascinating. I think if we keep talking about what happened over the past 5 years, we can keep talking for the whole night, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is so interesting because President Xi rose from that small village in a poverty-stricken area to one of the most important world leaders today. Leading the country under his presidency. Having so many achievements that was completely unimaginable just 5 years ago before he took office. And that is why he's winning some of the people's greatest trust here in China of re-electing him and probably one more term after after the removal of the two-term limits in the Constitution. By saying that, let's move on to the next topic about the constitutional amendment here in China, because that's also one of the biggest highlights of this year. That also, the
Western media, that was it for them, and perhaps they should have looked at a more holistic fashion of everything going on, but it was, someone once told me years ago when I was working at another news agency, the international media can only overdo one story at a time, meaning once they get their teeth into something, and they just hung on to that. But you were at that press conference where government officials talked for more than an hour, I guess, about what does this mean? And I'm curious to hear what you, because I watched it thinking I didn't expect to see this, and to me it was refreshing, to use that word. What did you think watching it live?
Actually, I think I've been talking to some of the deputies from not just the mainland, but also places like Hong Kong and Macau, and they were saying that they believe some Western media have been looking at this constitutional amendment at a very narrow scope by just singling out one article about removing the two-term limits of presidency. And they would say that this is a power struggle, this is lifelong term of the president, which has been completely denied by the press conference. And they have some good reasons for that. And also, actually, if you look at it, there are 21 changes in the Constitution, and actually that is just that is just the only term about removing the two constitutional.
For the president and vice president.
For the president and vice president. And also the 11 of them were actually focused on anti-corruption. And also some deputies say that you need to look at this one article about removing two-term limits at a holistic perspective, because this is not the whole Constitution. It's just one article of the Constitution. There are many other articles about restricting the power of the president, including how the president should be elected and how he should continue the term by, getting the widest public support here in China, and what kind of power he has and what kind of balances he must face. So there are many articles about how this power should be supervised and be restricted by the law. And also, as President Xi said, no one is actually above the law, particularly above the Constitution. Right?
I think also then that throws the ball on our court as journalists, because we're basically there to inform as well. So maybe we need also to play our part in terms of informing. Because when you talk about removing of presidential term limits or removing any kind of limits, people just know it's a free pass. So what we need is bring out those issues that you've said. For now, most people do not know they exist, perhaps. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So I think also the journalists and you and I, perhaps
we should do a better job explaining that.
Exactly,
right?
Because, saying this is what we have institutions, we have checks and balances, that this person is not just ruling as he likes.
I want to bring another thing in this discussion, and I've read a lot of opinion articles that have said, if you look what's going on in the UK with Brexit, leaving the EU, and you look at what's going on in the United States with its President Donald Trump and all the drama that surrounds him and his administration, President Barack Obama spent 8 years kind of crafting out a plan that Trump has spent 1 year completely undoing. And some of the opinion articles I've read said, what's wrong with continuity in a world that's kind of this pendulum.
There's always this debate about pendulum politics or the polarized politics in the United States, right?
Sure, and you think about what's going on in the Korean Peninsula, and China being a neighbor with the DPRK, maybe it's good to have this continuity, this commitment to a 5-year plan moving forward, so you at least know what's going to happen in one nation while all the others kind of go through the ebb and flow and the fits that is known for government change. I mean, it happens.
Does it all boil down to, countries just charting their own path according to what works out for them or works for them?
Actually, I heard many deputies saying that. They would say that it's time for China to keep comparing itself to the Western way of governance, because, as you said, we have seen some of the flaws in the Western way of democracy. And here in China, it's been keep exploring its own path of development, experienced setbacks like the Cultural Revolution, and then with the reform and opening up, and also the achievement it has made over the past 40 years, it's a miracle. No country has achieved something like raising the country's status from a poorly industrialized nation to the world's second largest economy in just less than 4 decades.
And also it's committed to the environment. It's not just doing this because if you listen to what Trump is saying, when it comes to the economy or the environment, the economy is going to win every time. And in Daqing, an area that's depressed economically, there was an effort to bring a big aluminum plant up into that area, and the locals said, no, we don't want the pollution here. And that's been another one of the cornerstones of President Xi's presidency as well. So he's very committed to, he's now, the global leader in terms of the Paris Accord, because Trump has said that he wants to take the United States out of it.
Yeah, so it's actually making China somehow more predictable than the United States in his, at least in the diplomacy, right?
Yeah, certainly. But it's interesting. I think it's also coming in. This new leadership is coming in at a very critical point for China. I think we only have about 2 years to 2020, which I think is a make or break year for China. There's so many goals that have been set, and so I think, like we were discussing earlier on, one of the major challenges and major roles of the current administration and any appointments that have been made is to kind of maintain the consistency in trying to achieve these policies that have already been laid down. And I think that's what the government was trying to work out with this even restructuring of the cabinet, because they can see the challenge that's ahead. They've already got this year, this 2020 that is fast approaching, when they have to achieve, I think, a modern, prosperous nation. The skies have to be bluer or something.
Right. And also some cool things like providing internet access for everyone.
For everybody.
Yeah.
So they're really tough times ahead, but I think all these changes that we're seeing in terms of the restructuring of the cabinet, the merging of different agencies, it simply shows that the country is trying to get ready to take head on whatever lies ahead.
I shared a story with you guys about the corruption issue. When we were in Daqing, when we were getting ready to shoot, we sat down with some local government leaders for lunch, and the same thing happened in Liangjia. And when lunch came, they made a point of saying, we can provide you tea, water, or soft drinks, but we can have no baijiu, no wine.
Alcohol, right?
No alcohol. That's part of the corruption.
Amount of discipline.
And they made a point of saying it. I mean, it was only lunch. I didn't think much about it, but then I thought, wow, this is...
and no one is watching anyway.
And no one was going to break that mandate. So
Amazing.
it was...
Actually, by saying that, let's move on to the second part about the Constitution, which is the most important part. 11 of the 21 clauses, the amendments, were actually about supervisory commission, which is about fighting corruption in a more institutionalized way. And definitely what you're talking about is actually the 8-point regulations launched by President Xi right after he took office in 2013. One of the most important things is to reduce the extravagancy in the banquets, particularly when they are spending public money. And when they're just trying to show some sort of hospitality to foreign reporters, to our foreign guests, of course it's okay for them to give them a bit of a treat for the local food. Right?
Everybody knows Chinese food, and every community takes pride, and so they bring out their dishes and tell you why they're wonderful. And for an outsider coming in, it's nice. You have that time to talk. We want to shoot here. We want to do this. Are there any difficulties?
But definitely no alcohol.
Yeah. But
this is completely different 5 years ago, because at the time when we were doing field reports in some of the provinces in China, one of the most important ways to show hospitality is to get you all drunk.
Oh my.
Sometimes even in the middle of the day.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the rampant problem here in China. So you are wasted for the rest of the day, and the efficiency of working is really low. And most importantly, they're spending public money. And they are being extravagant in ordering the dishes and bringing all the best beers, best wines to the table, which may be a hospitality, but it's excessive part of hospitality.
Yeah, it is excessive, and I think that from the continent of Africa, it's something that you follow and you cover, and you've been asked about by media from African nations as well as Western nations.
Yeah, it's one of the issues, I think, where China is concerned. There'll always be the issue, and perhaps maybe the Western countries will raise the issue of corruption, telling China, you know what, as long as you have the wallet and the pass, the money pass, you have a free way to enter Africa and to rule Africa any way that you like. And I think this has been backed up by China's stand that, non-interference. But the thing is, when you go to Africa, you kind of get a feeling of what China is doing in terms of the infrastructure. I don't think there's any country where China hasn't left a footprint. And I think that was a change when you compare with the Western countries, because most of the time they will have to kind of attach their grants or loans to a certain development. You know, you need to correct this part. And they say with China, you're there as long as you have the money. And that's why they've been told that, you know what, you people are being corrupt, that you're bringing corruption money in Africa. And as long as you have the money, you can have your way, even in undemocratic countries. Yeah.
Actually, I've never been doing any field report in Africa, but I think I can imagine that, because when we are going abroad, spending our budget from CCTV, which is also a state-owned media, state-owned organization, I think you guys have more say on that, because you are foreigners and you're not quite used to the Chinese way of getting reimbursement, right?
It's very thorough. It's very thorough.
Yes,
in the
you put
past,
it well.
it used to be, you know, a big problem. They get the so-called 发票 or the invoice or receipt from anywhere, and then they put it into their budget, and then they get the money back, which is a big loophole in corruption. But now, would you guys share with us what happened on your budget?
I'll be glad. I mean, to me, it's nothing that it's just thorough. It's very detailed.
Yeah.
Like all the receipts have to be the original. No handwritten receipts.
Exactly.
If you're in a taxi, let's say, and the taxi's receipt machine is broken, and the gentleman or gentlewoman, the woman has to write something, we routinely take a photograph of that person holding the receipt and turn that photograph in as well. It's nothing that is difficult or backbreaking, but you learn quickly. Pulling out of a garage and suddenly, oops, they're out of paper, that thing. Well, I'll pull over and I'll wait till they put the paper in. You have to do it properly. And that's the way, and I'm sure that our accountants go through a lot more than we know about to make sure that all the money is spent properly. Do you have the same thing?
Oh my. It becomes worse. You can imagine when you go to some of the countries that really don't have the machines, the ETRs, or you call them the ETRs. When you go to them, you only find handwritten, and you need to write an explanation, because some of the war-torn countries, they don't have those ETRs. So you need handwritten receipts, but it's all part of accountability. You literally have to account for everything. So yeah.
I'm going to give a shout out to our accountants, though, because they work with us so well in Washington. They really do. They say, we want to get this through, but you need to do A, B, and C first. So
a lot of restrictions to make us accountable in spending the money.
Certainly,
Right? I think it's going to be even more difficult in the future, because they're definitely tightening the rules, trying to make sure it's more regulated and trying to close all the loopholes. Actually, if we talk about this supervisory commission, it's something that a Hong Kong deputy told me is something similar to the so-called Independent Commission Against Corruption in Hong Kong. It was an organization fighting corruption in Hong Kong, established in the year 1974.
Wow.
And Hong Kong used to be a quite corrupt place. I think you guys learned about it. It's a capitalist place where, people with money could do whatever they want.
A lot of money.
Under the British rule.
Right.
And then after they built it up in 1974, Hong Kong has been turned into one of the world's least corrupt. I think it ranks somewhere around 15th out of the 180 countries in the world back in the colonial time. Now it's still keeping that record going. So the Hong Kong deputy told me that this is quite similar to what is happening on the supervisory commission, because it used to be a supervisory ministry here in China, and is under the rule of is report directly to the state council. So they're actually being governed by the officials, administrative officials here in China, but now it's been completely taken out from the state council and independent, running in parallel with the state council. Wow. So it has a much more independent position to actually supervise all the administrative officials here in China. So they're covering everyone here in China.
To me, it's hard to believe that the 2+ weeks winds up tomorrow. I mean, there's been so much. And every time, we have a group WeChat where everybody sends their scripts in, and there's a handful of reporters, and you're at the top of the list. I'll look at 6 a.m., you'll have a script. I'll look at 10 p.m. So you've been working really, really long hours covering there. I'm just curious from an outsider standpoint, what do you take away from this? Because everybody I've talked to said this has been a very special 2 sessions. I'm just curious.
I think this year, many things, the things that we were talking about, basically the 2 things, the election of the new leadership and constitutional amendment, don't really happen every year during the 2 sessions, because I've been covering it for several years since I started working here in CCTV. But now it's, this time we have the new leader elected, and also we had this constitutional amendment, which makes China more under the rule of law. Because one thing that really struck me is about the constitutionality review of this year's constitutional amendment because they built up this special commission called Constitution and Law Commission, which somehow looks like the Supreme Court in the US. They can judge which law or which regulation is constitutional or not. Actually, one thing that really was interesting during my coverage is that a political advisor has already proposed to abolish certain laws in China. He told me that the current punishment on prostitution crimes is unconstitutional and should be abolished.
Really?
Of course, it should be discussed by the NPC Standing Committee. But the idea from him is that, currently when someone, either a client or a prostitute, has been caught by the police, they would be put into the so-called custody and education process for at least half a year, which is basically about confining their freedom and teaching their so-called social ethics lessons for half a year without freedom. And this political advisor from Guangdong told me that this is unconstitutional because according to the Chinese constitution, no citizen should be jailed or be confined for such a long time without a proper judgment from the court. So there are a lot of regulations that are being operated in society, but now they're changing that. And that is why I say this never happened in the past in China. They're now using the constitution to judge the people's behavior instead of just using the laws and regulations, sometimes not passed in the right way. So they're actually completing some of the debts that China used to have during its fast-paced development.
I think also I was reading that this reshuffle, the restructuring, is actually like the 8th one since 1982, so it's also such a big deal. It's never really done. Yeah.
Yeah. So what impressed you the most? One last thing, last question.
I think I had it the best because I got to see so much of China. And to me, it's just, when you think about a nation of 1.4 billion people, we've talked about it, just seems like an overwhelming number. But when you get and you meet these people one-on-one, you see the old people, you see the people working, you see the children and hoping for their future, seeing how what happens here in Beijing in the short 2 weeks really is going to affect all of these people in various different ways. And while they may not have the access to all the multimedia that we have, or the people in Shanghai, Beijing, Hong Kong, places have, they follow what's going on and they know that what's going to happen out here. We talked to a mechanic up in Dacheng. We just walked into he was working on a tire and asked him, he said he doesn't follow the day-to-day, but he will see what comes out of it because he knows that's going to determine if he's going to be profitable or not. And he's hoping that they provide some benefits to the Northeast area and they can expand and bring more automotive entities in. Just the fact that this guy, who probably had no great formal education, knew all of this, kind of spoke volumes to me about how closely people do follow what goes on here.
Okay, with that we will call it a day. And actually today we talked about the election, the new leadership, and we also talked about the constitution, which sound a bit abstract, but actually they're all about how we are improving people's lives. It's all about stories of people. So all these abstract political ideas finally boils down about what we have done to the Chinese people. Thank you very much for joining us.